Okay. Good. So good morning, everyone. On behalf of BONARD, I'm very happy to welcome you all to our webinar session on LATAM student housing. My name is Santos Bicalho, and I am BONARD's Managing Director for the LATAM region. This is going to be a 1-hour session. We're going to have it in 3 different parts. The first part is going to be around 20 minutes, where I'm going to dedicate to share data and intel updates from our 2020 report that was presented February last year here in São Paulo. So what we did, the regional report has been augmented with data from 4 new countries and 8 additional cities. We are seeing student housing gaining strength in this region despite COVID. After I do the presentation, I'll have the honor to call the panelists that have joined us here today, Professor Gabriela de Brelas from Unifesp and Professor Antonio Carlos Marques from USP. We are going to debate some questions on student housing, and at the end of the debate, I will invite, you're very welcome to send us questions. Please use the Q&A functionality on Zoom. It's better than chat, so we can track your questions. And you're welcome to send the questions as we go. Don't wait for the end, but as you see questions, you're very welcome to send the questions to us. And before I start, I know I'm seeing here some names, familiar names, people who are familiar with us, but I don't know if everybody is familiar with BONARD, so allow me to properly introduce ourselves. We are a global market intelligence and strategic development firm based in Vienna, Austria, specialized in alternative asset classes. We have 4 offices spread across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, and 40 specialists in the asset class. Our team has already delivered 468 projects in student housing across different geographies. And as data experts, we monitor over 7,000 student housing assets worldwide. In terms of clients, we serve investors, developers, operators, and educational institutions, providing data analysis, intelligence report, underwriting reports, on top of strategy development projects. We are a member of United Nations WTO. We are also a member of ESOMAR, which is a global research organization, and we have the honor of being GRI Club Knowledge Partner for student housing. Now let's move to the definition of student housing as an asset class. Today, student housing is an established, stable, transparent, and documented asset class, attracting interest and investments of over 700 companies globally. When we look to markets like the US and in the UK, student housing is already very well established and has enjoyed over 2 decades of asset class development at least. When we look to markets like continental Europe and Australia, we are seeing student housing solidifying with over a decade of investments and transactions of portfolio already happening. When we look at Latin America, we are probably here at year 4 of the asset class establishment and development. Student housing is considered a defensive asset class, and it has a counter-cyclical nature because as we monitor this asset class, we see that the more students during and after economic recessions, as we are in the middle of an economic recession, we are seeing this trend solidifying. In terms of ranking of sectors based on a PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC report, we see that student housing, it occupies the 15th place, attracting investments and interest than other more traditional asset classes like service apartments, flexible service offices, and hotels. It is important to define the assets that are covered in this asset class. and they are what the industry calls PBSA, Purpose-Built Student Accommodation. A PBSA is basically housing built specifically by private developers for students to live in. It usually takes the form of rooms with common shared facilities. In the proportion of 30% common shared facilities, 70% rooms, more or less. In terms of common shared facilities, we see that student housing, the PBSA, would offer students with a common kitchen, laundry, study rooms, lounge, gym, bars, living areas. And when we look to more developed countries like UK, US, we see a variety of different products being offered to students, from premium options to affordable options. When you get the PDF of this presentation, you will be in the position to click here and visit the websites of these brands that we are providing here as an example. This is not like the hospitality industry where you have 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. It's not established like that, but that's how the market perceives it. In the next slide, I'm going to share a video where you can at least have a look and feel of what a product of student housing is. Let's see if the video is going to, yeah, there it goes. Good. Let's move forward. Now that the definition of this asset class was provided, let's take a closer look at the LATAM region and the data we have collected for that. Last year, we published the study covering basically 2 countries, Argentina and Brazil, with a focus on 3 cities, Buenos Aires, Rio, and Sao Paulo. So this year, we have augmented the research scope to include 4 additional countries. So we've added Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. And we have amplified the city reach from 3 to 11. For the selected countries, we see a combined student population in Latin America of 20 million students, out of which 6 million students are considered mobile students, and I will explain that in a minute. A mobile student is any domestic or international student that leaves his or her hometown to study elsewhere. And when we look at the countries, the profile of a mobile student is different. Like in Brazil, most mobile students, they are from within the country, so are domestic. Brazil experienced domestic student mobility. The other countries in Latin America, they have both. They have mobile students either from within the country or from other countries, and that's basically because they share the same language. Mobile students are key for student housing because those are the students who are actually needing and searching for a bed. In terms of size in LATAM, Mexico and Brazil have thousands of higher education institutions, as you can see in the table, and they have very large numbers of university students. Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and Peru, they do not have the same size of higher education institutions, but they have significant number of students, mostly being attracted to their capital cities, and we'll look into this in the next slide. So for the selected countries in LATAM, we collected data for the major student cities, and it covered mostly capital cities with higher volumes. And in Brazil, we included 4 cities to our last year study. So as last year we had São Paulo and Rio, now we have data from Belo Horizonte, Florianópolis, Ribeirão Preto, and Curitiba. For the other countries, we have data on their capital cities: Bogotá, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Lima. What we are looking in this chart is basically the total number of university students, followed by mobile students, and the current offer of PBSA in each one of these countries, with the estimate of the pipeline that will be deployed this and next year, with a very important KPI for student housing, which is provision rate. Investors, developers, and operators of student housing, when they are scoping a market to define if they're going to add the PBSA to that market, they really look at the provision rate. The provision rate is the calculation of the number of beds divided by the number of students. We see that across Latin America, the provision rate is below 1%, with some markets like the market in Colombia and the market in Argentina with almost 2%, but still below 2%. When we look at more developed countries where PBSA is already established, where student housing is already established, we've seen provision rates of up to 20%. But in average, we could say that a market is mature when it reaches around 15% provision rate. As we show data on mobile students and provision rates, which are indicative of market opportunities, we felt it could be useful to explore it a bit more on where in LATAM opportunities are. So in this chart, we see here that over 50% of Colombia's student population is heavily concentrated around Bogotá, and which distinguishes it from other cities in LATAM. We can even say that when we look at this chart, that probably Santiago and Buenos Aires also concentrated significant student numbers, student population of ratios between 24 and 28%. Brazil, Mexico, and Peru are more fragmented markets in terms of student concentration. It is interesting to observe the profile of some Brazilian cities like Ribeirão Preto in the state of São Paulo and Florianópolis in the state of Santa Catarina. These two cities, they share something in common. They have public universities delivering well-qualified degree programs. And that's sufficient to attract qualified student population who will be attending a public university without paying tuition fees, with more income disposal to spend in proper accommodation options. And still, you'll see in the next slides that they are not supplied with the student housing. Now let's compare existing demand and supply in LATAM with other territories. We have here on the left-hand side a table with what we see in terms of total students and PBSA in European cities, in selected European cities. And we selected Paris, London, Madrid, Berlin, Amsterdam, and Porto. And on the right-hand side, we have the chart with the total student population for the LATAM cities, with the current offer in PBSA and the offer in pipeline. Let's take a closer look at Paris. Paris offers over 13,000 beds with a provision rate of 2.6%. Still very low when you compare to London. London is a little bit different, and we'll have a look at London soon. But if we get Paris, and if we compare the total student population in Paris to what we see in Bogota, in São Paulo, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires, we see that either the cities have large student population compared to Paris, or they are comparable to Paris with lower number of competitive beds, even when we calculate it with the beds in pipeline. Still, there is room to be explored in the city. Let's take a closer look to London. Okay, London has a student population that is comparable to Rio de Janeiro, as we see here in this data. Of course, the offer in London is probably one of the highest in the world. London has one of the highest provision rates in the world. We are not expecting Rio to follow London in terms of numbers. However, in Rio de Janeiro, it's 4 ranked universities, 3 being public. 2 are federal university, 1 is state university, and the other is PUC, the Catholic university. This indicates opportunities to be explored in a city like Rio. If we look at Madrid, Berlin, Amsterdam, and Porto, these are very interesting benchmarks for other selected cities in Latin America. And Porto is quite interesting. I find Porto very interesting because the Portuguese market is still being developed. There are probably 16 PBSA buildings in Porto, serving 2,000 students average. So if we compare the population of Porto to the population that we see in cities like Ribeirão Preto in Brazil and Florianópolis, this gives us an indication of what the offer could be in these cities. When we look at supply side only, we see that although there are several different types of student accommodation in Latin America, few offer what we consider a competitive PBSA bed. In the total beds calculation here, we are considering options like rented apartment, co-living, share apartments like repúblicas, student hostels, this type of accommodation, but not proper PBSAs. We are also considering public options being offered by public universities. It's interesting to see the benchmark. We see that even in Europe, where number of PBSA beds is much higher, it remains a fraction of the total bed supply, showing that student housing is one of the few options, one of the options that the students have to choose as a place to live. In terms of development pipeline in Latin America, in the selected cities, we dedicated some time scoping the assets that are under development in Latin America. Across 11 cities, we have identified 45 PBSA buildings being developed with an estimated number of 5,800 new beds entering the market until 2022. We could say that in average, a PBSA to be economically viable, the building should have at least 230 beds, anything between 200 to 230 beds. So if we extrapolate that figure to include beds in pipeline in Mexico City and Campinas, where data with number of beds was not available, we could forecast that the figure would of beds being offered to the market until 2022 would go over 6,000 beds. That's an estimate. But this is an important indication that it confirms the growth and establishment of the asset class in Latin America. An important KPI here is also for us to look at is also the rent comparison and how much money students spend in monthly rents. So we have here on the left hand side we have what students spend in Europe compared on the right hand side what they're spending currently in Latin America. Before I compare these figures, it is important to mention the type of rooms that we are comparing here. we've chosen two different types of rooms to compare. One is a single ensuite, and the other is a studio. A single ensuite is a room with a bathroom, no kitchen. And it's normally what students are really looking for. If you talk to students in Latin America, that's their preferred accommodation type, room and a bathroom, single. The second option is a studio, which is normally more expensive, and it includes the kitchenette. Okay, it's not a kitchen where you can probably cook. I'm in Brazil, so I use the figure of a feijoada. It's not that type of room, but you can cook a meal. When we look at the figures itself, Santiago and Mexico City, they are showing higher uh, monthly rents. But we have to be careful here because the sample size was smaller if we compare to what we have in Colombia and Brazil. We could say that the market, the Latin market, can be mostly compared to the market that we see in Austria and in Germany. We have here the figures for Vienna and Bonn. And of course, there is an important factor affecting these calculations here because this year and last year, Latin American currencies have suffered the effect of heavy currency devaluation. But this is still indicative that the rents are much lower when compared to larger markets in Europe, like London, like Amsterdam, Paris, and Madrid. There is one important issue to cover here, which is rent prices will be affected by economic models used in the investment phase. And a lot depend on how land and build costs impact the returns in the selected cities. We see that land costs, they are 24 to 20%, 28% of total investment. So finding cheaper land close to university is key to offer competitive rent rates to students. I still have two slides to go before I call our panelists, but I wanted to share two interesting figures that we have here. Last year, we went to market and we asked students what they wanted. Of course, there is no doubt this is a no-brainer. The number one facility that students wanted to see in a student housing was Wi-Fi. We all know that. And it's being offered. The other, number two and number three, were communal kitchen and laundry room. But we figure out to the students that we spoke with, and that was a survey conducted in Brazil, that some of the PBSAs, they're still missing gym, library, and more. And when we say library, it's not exactly library as we consider like library in a university, but mostly an area where students can quietly study. So it's more like a study room. We are reaching the end of the presentation, and here we have some of the investments, the student housing projects that are being deployed between now and 2022. In Brazil, there are two prominent student housing brands, Share and You Living. You Living is about to open its building in Santos. It's also about to open its building here in São Paulo, in Pinheiros, and a building in Campinas. Share is about to open its building in São Paulo, in Butantã, and one in Vila Mariana very soon. Bogotá saw an investment called Living. It's Living X21, which is an investment from CA Ventures. They also have another building there. A Student is about to open doors in 2022 in Santiago, and Casa Campus, which is a very traditional operator, is opening 4 premises this year in Argentina, but has planned to expand in Latin America. So now that we're about to conclude this presentation, let us share the last findings in this year's report. We spoke to university representatives to understand how they saw student housing as part of the academic ecosystem. So there is general understanding that student housing contributes with many benefits to students' life and journey. A good quality student housing building is able to support university recruitment and student retention. University also see student housing contributing to students' performance because it improves the academic environment. The students commute shorter time, we call it that they commute pajama distance, and they have a more interactive experience with other students during downtime. Universities, they also say that student housing support the admissions officers when they have to provide appropriate accommodation solution to freshman students, to first year students, especially for those who are coming from different countries or from different cities. Now let's invite our panelists so they can share their own experience and speak from the university perspective. Before I conclude this presentation, let me welcome these two outstanding representatives from Unifesp and from USP, who will share with us their views on how student housing impacts student and university life. We have here today with us Professor Gabriela de Brelas. She is the Chief of Staff at Unifesp. She has also served as institutional relations mediating the relationship of Unifesp with public and private actors, responsible for university institutional partnerships. She holds a BA, Master of Science, and PhD in Public Administration. And we have here Professor Antonio Carlos Marques. He's a biologist, PhD in Science, full professor at USP, research associate at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., with over 230 scientific publications. He's a former president of the Innovation Agency at USP, director of the Center for Marine Biology, and he's currently part of the management group of social assistant of USP, staff. Staff has the mission to establish partnerships inside and outside USP to benefit the USP students. So let me welcome you. I'll stop sharing my screen. There you go. So welcome, Professor Gabriela, and welcome, Professor Antonio Carlos. Let's start our discussion. The first question we have here is in relation to mobile students. So our research shows that in average, Latin American countries, they have in universities, they have in average 30% of student mobility, students coming either from different countries or from different cities. How do you see that in Unifesp, and how do you see that in USP? I will start with Professor Gabriela, please.
Thank you very much, Santuza, for the invitation. Good morning, everybody. Well, in Unifesp, we are having a lot of new information. We do have students coming from other cities. That's a reality of public universities. It's a reality. And we have campuses in 6 different cities. So we have a reality in each of these cities. In some campuses, for example, São José dos Campos, we have 70% of the students coming from the interior of São Paulo or other states. In the Baixada Santista, for example, we have only 36% of the students from the coast. All the rest come from the metropolitan area and other cities of São Paulo and other states. But I believe that in considering all the students, this information is about new students, considering all the students of the Unifesp, this 30% rate would be correct for us as well. We don't have the information for all the students, only for the new ones. And we do know that 90% of our students are, 19% are today living in student shared houses, 7% alone, and 53% around with their parents. So we see this mobility happening in the last years, but more in the recent years, it's growing.
Thank you. And Professor Antonio Carlos, how would you see that for USP, from the USP side?
Good morning. Good morning, you all in America. Good afternoon, you all in Europe. Thank you very much to Santuza and BONARD for this opportunity to show the university. I expect I can provide the information you are interested. Like Unifesp, the University of São Paulo we used to call that USP. So from now on, I'm going to speak about USP. So USP has 6 campuses in the interior of the state of São Paulo, and we have 2 campuses in the capital, in São Paulo city. We are a very large university. We have we have 97,000 students, including undergraduate students and graduate students both. And like Gabriela said, it's quite heterogeneous from campus to campus. So we have differences between the campuses, but we are considered to be in many university rankings the top 1 university in Latin America, and we are large. So because of these characteristics, we attract a lot of students from, especially from the interior of the state of São Paulo, but also from other states in Brazil and from abroad as well. And we estimate that on average, we have about 70% of our students studying on campus far from their hometowns.
It's large, isn't it? Gabriela, you want to say something?
Yes. No, just complementing. USP is older than we are as university. The Federal University of São Paulo, as a university, has only 26 years. It was born in 1933 with a medical school, but until 2006, we only had 5 courses: medicine, nursing, and other courses in the health area. And now we have 54 in these 7 campuses, 6 implanted and 1 being implanted. And we have around 14,000 undergrad students and 6,000 graduate students, and around 1,500 residents in the medical school and other areas of in the health area. So it's a big difference. We have differences in all these campuses. In São Paulo, we have the medical school, and then we have Diadema, we have São José dos Campos, Guarulhos, Baixada Santista, Osasco, and the East Zone campus that being implanted. And we have a very different reality, but it's very common, it's very similar to USP. As a university of reference, and public universities in Brazil are the most conceited ones and the best in the rankings, not nationally, but also international, not just nationally, but also internationally. So people come to study in São Paulo in these universities. It's definitely something that happens. And I believe that our data is very similar to USP in this, regarding this.
We see that the public universities in Brazil, especially after ENEM made everything more easy, for students in Brazil to be more mobile. In my time, and probably in your time, you would only apply for USP, Unifesp. You went to GV, I went to UFMG. I had no reason to apply elsewhere because it was expensive, right? You would do applications for different universities for vestibular, and with ENEM, student mobility is much better now.
But may just complement something that I think it's important about public universities in Brazil. We have the quota system that makes our profile the profile of our student very peculiar, because we have a law since 2012 that has a quota of 50% for students with low income and from public schools. So it's important to know this about Brazilian public universities, because it's the profile of our students has to be analyzed considering these characteristics.
Right. Yeah, so if I may add to, USP also has an affirmative action. It's about the same time or a little bit younger than that applied in the Unifesp, and we have the same target. We have 50% of our students coming from public high schools with low income, and we also have a race affirmative action. Besides that, we have these students coming from, most of them are from their hometowns, because these 50%, exactly these 50%, they do not have means to study in another town. So the university provides a lot of financial support to these students, including financial support for housing, to rent a place for them. So the student affords that for many, many students, actually. And um, I'm looking here, but most of the students, it's about, I think, 15%, they have this kind of scholarship, this kind of financial support. Besides, we have other financial supports as well that they may comment later.
Good. Just before we move to the second question, I wanted to tell the audience, the participants, that they are welcome to send us questions using the Q&A that we have here on Zoom. So I see some questions coming up, and we, at the last 10 minutes of this presentation, will return to the questions, but you're welcome to send either for the panelists or for myself in relation to the report. I see one of the questions here is asking if we're going to share the presentation. Yes, so once we conclude, you will receive the PDF of the presentation. So let's move to the second question, which is related to the amount that students dedicate for housing, for their living necessities, like how much they spend in rent, in transportation, in meals. I know you may not be in the position to say correctly, this is it, but at least an estimate. And if you don't have an estimate, it would be interesting to learn how much budget, if you're assisting some students, how much budget the university provides to those students. So, Gabriela, if you allow me, I'll start now with Professor Antonio Carlos.
Good. So first, let me explain one very important thing in Brazil. The public universities, they have no tuition in Brazil. So they are free of charge. And therefore, the students, they don't spend money with tuition. Besides of not having tuition, the big universities like USP and also Unifesp, as I said, they provide financial support for the students. So as I said, we have about 15% of our undergrads and about more or less the same, or a little less of that of our grad students with financial support. For those that don't live in the university dorms, in the university housing accommodations. So we spend a lot of money from our budget to do that, because we are focusing to have a retention of these students. I believe it's the same in many other universities in Brazil. Therefore, if the students, they are not spending on tuition, so they have more money to spend on other stuff. And also, in Brazil, they don't spend, for instance, with public transportation in many cities, because public transportation is free for the students. And besides, they can have like support for their meals. So for instance, at the University of São Paulo, one students may have the 3 meals in a day for about $1 per day, what it's very cheap. So I think they save a lot of money with that. And I believe that they have, besides of the conditions of to have this financial support from the university, they are in a good condition to have, like, to find a place, to rent a place, especially like shared place, shared apartments, shared houses.
Thank you. That's interesting. Professor Gabriela?
Yes, considering the Federal University of São Paulo, our reality is about 10% of our undergrad students have a kind of scholarship subsidized for this kind of assistance, housing, food, and this the same thing as USP, the same model, but it's only 10%, around 1,500.
Okay. Let's move to the third question, which is, if you currently offer any student housing options for students, and if you do, if you could tell us more about what the offer, and if you don't offer this facility, how do you treat, accommodation in the university? Let's start with you, Gabriela, please.
Thank you, Santuza, for the question. Well, we have expanded very fast in the last years, and we focused in building the infrastructure for the campuses. And we weren't able, because not that we didn't want to have, we really wanted to have student housing, but we didn't have the funding from the federal government. So we don't have student housing in any of our campuses. And that's a demand from our students. Many come from other cities, and in all these different municipalities we are located, and we are starting to better understand how we could provide this kind of housing for our students. So we are aware they need, we are aware that they stay in the bus or in the subway many hours a day when going to the university and commuting. So we would really like to give them this possibility. So we are starting to better understand what are the possibilities and what is the reality, considering that we don't have this financial support from government because of the Brazilian crisis. So now we are studying the possibilities. That's why this kind of conversation is so important for us.
And do you offer, you said you offer some financial support to students for housing, right?
Yes. Yes, we do, especially for the more vulnerable. We have different values depending on the vulnerability of the student. They don't receive everybody the same amount. We have differences. Some of them just receive a small amount and others receive more depending on in their vulnerability situation.
Professor Antonio Carlos, tell us, we know that USP has some student housing, so it would be interesting to learn about it.
Yes, we do. We have accommodations, student housing in 6 of our campuses. So we don't have, in 2 campuses, we don't have no accommodation at all. Let's say that this student housing, it's provided and managed by the university. I would say that we are quite good in our end activities like research, teaching, and so, but this is not an end activity for us. So we spend a lot of money and a lot of energy trying to do this. We are not a company prepared to do that. So we have our own personnel to do that. But if you look in terms of the number of beds that we provide, it's not much, actually. It's about 3% of the total students of the university. So we provide that for undergrads and grads. We have about 100,000 students, and we provide 2,700 beds only. So it's about 3%, as I said. And generally, they are apartments with 3 bedrooms, and some of them may have kitchens, some of them, they don't have kitchen. And they are on campus, always on campus, on the different campuses. And what else? They are not very, very large. They're about, let's say, between 30 and 40 square meters. And we have 3 students in each of them. So in some cities like São Paulo, like Ribeirão Preto, 2 of the cities that you have mentioned in your research, we have a lot of room to expand. But I don't see the university doing that by itself, because as I said, we are not experts on that. So it's very time and budget consuming for us. So I think there is room in this way to have this kind of service provided around the campuses of the university, for sure.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, Professor Antonio Carlos, in which year was CRUSP launched? Do you know? Because
yes, I do.
It's been there for quite a while.
Yeah. The CRUSP is the residence, the university residence at the main campus, or at the biggest campus of the University of São Paulo. And it was built for the Pan American Games in the late 60s. So São Paulo hosted the Pan American Games, I believe it was in 71. So right before that, the CRUSP was built, and CRUSP has a huge history in terms of social, economic, and political influence in Brazil, because during the dictatorship, we have a lot of students that were part of this resistant movement at that time that lived in CRUSP. And so we are very proud of our residents, though it's very difficult to manage that.
So we can say that USP is the pioneer of student housing in Brazil. Because
I'm
it
not
was
sure, but maybe. I'm not sure.
you'll be there for quite a while. That's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So another question here from our side, which is the population of mobile students that you have in both Unifesp and USP. Where do you see this kid living? I mean, in terms of type of accommodation, is it a República? Is it a shared apartment? Where do you see them living? Professor Gabriela.
From our students, I can definitely, it's in 20% are living in shared student housing, like the model of a República. Not necessarily very close to the campus, but in this kind of apartments.
Right. And in USP?
So as I said, we have only 3% of beds for the total amount of students we have. And I know that we have this research done, and I know that many of our students, 38%, they live with their parents. And another 19% or 20%, they live with their families, their spouses and kids when they have children. But about 36% of the students, they live like in this shared house outside campus with roommates from USP or from other roommates not from USP, or they live alone. About 16% of our students, they live alone outside campus, right? And as Gabriela said, some of these students, they live far from the campus they study. So for instance, 33% of our students take like over 1 hour to commute to the university. It's a lot of time. And just to be clear, more or 20%, it's about 2 hours to commute to the university. What means that I believe these students would appreciate very much to live closer to the university for sure.
Yeah. That's a reality from São Paulo and the metropolitan area. That's something we are a very, very big city with a lot of traffic, a lot of people commuting from different areas and zones, and that makes transportation something very difficult. And 2 hours, it's kind of, we have the same situation. Our students, 50% take more than an hour to go to the university. So that's a reality our students face, definitely.
Yeah. And just to add to this profile as well, about 53% of our students have their hometowns far from São Paulo. When I mean far, it's about at least 100 kilometers not from São Paulo, sorry, from the campus they study. So they are not from that city, that town, and so they have to find a way to live there. And sometimes they cannot afford these, and they have to live very far from the university. And even for those that are resident, as Gabriela said, São Paulo is a very tough city. So, sometimes you can spend hours and hours in traffic jams. And so, and I believe these students, they are very part of that, unfortunately.
When we ask the students that drop out, it's less common than in private universities, the dropout, because public universities are very good and offer, they don't have to pay. So, but we do have dropout students. one of the main reasons is because of the distance. That's something, the time of commuting and how many hours they take in the commuting process. It's one of the reasons to drop out. So that's something we're very worried, and we really want to help students to have better conditions.
Well, in the interest of time, we have 7 minutes left. And I've heard some minutes ago, everybody popping the 15-minute ring that we have upcoming meetings at 11. So in the interest of time, I will turn to some of the questions we have here from the audience. The first one is not exactly a question, but it's from Veronica from Mexico, that she would like to see more housing options in Mexico. We'll connect with her. I guess that Mexico City, I've been there many times. I'm familiar with the Mexican market. I can say that is as complex as the city of São Paulo. So I would assume that most of your answers would apply to Mexico City, but just extrapolating the discussion. So the next question we have here that is interesting is from Paulo Ribeiro. He would like to ask about COVID impact on student housing today, or I don't, as USP has student housing, Unifesp doesn't, but it would be interesting for you if we could say 30 seconds how you see the impact on COVID in your university. Professor Antônio Carlos, start with you.
Well, some of the universities in the United States, they asked for the students in the dorms to leave the dorms. We didn't do that. But most of our students, they left the dorms. They are not in the dorms. So we have about, I would say, 30% of the common population of the dorms. And these guys, most of them, they don't have to go. Some of them, they are from abroad, from like other Latin American countries or from Africa. And so they don't have to go. And we are trying to provide all support we can to these students. I'm not going to say all the actions, but believe me, we are providing from like cleaning products for their apartments, food, and even testing. So we are trying to provide everything for these students.
Well, in our case, as we don't have student housing, we don't face this kind of thinking, but we think what will happen with education after the pandemic, because there is a pressure from some groups that we should have more remote education and less presential education. But for our model of teaching and developing all the educational system, the presential class is very important. So we definitely, for undergrad courses, it's very important to be in the campus and learning and having this interchange with students, colleagues with other courses. So I don't believe that undergrad will turn to an hybrid system or a long distance courses. That's not what I can see that will happen, probably with graduate and extension courses and things like that. But for undergrad, I believe that we'll continue having the presential courses. I don't know if USP has the same opinion, but we will continue going to university and having all this interchange and thinking with our students. We have the vaccine, we will be vaccinated in some months, not now. We'll have this.
Well, the next question is interesting. It's from Kane Weiner, a good friend of ours. He's asking what percentage of the undergraduate students of USP and Unifesp have household income higher than 15,000 Brazilian reais, or could spend over 2,500 Brazilian reais in total living expenses. I don't know if you would have that precise answer to that, but at least an estimate.
More than 1,500?
Yes, over 15,000 Brazilian reais household income, or could pay 2,500 Brazilian reais in total living expenses.
So may I, Gabriel?
Well, I believe it's around 15% of our students. This kind.
15% of Gabriela de Brelas
Yes.
from Unifesp. And USP?
Yeah, I would say that this corresponds to what we call stratum A of our socioeconomic strata in Brazil. And we do have about 18% of these students in this stratum.
That's right. Good, thank you. So the next question comes from José Carlos de Almeida Camargo Filho. It's a question for me. Hello, just to know if the prices showed in the slide 13 refers only about rent or refers about rent, common sense, water, energy. It's the total package. So it's the total amount spent on total rent. That includes average of water and spend. It doesn't include whatever they get, like stipend. Let's say if they're asking if students are paying someone to clean the room, it's not included, but it's the average expenditure. The other question is interesting, is also for me. How do you see student housing with rooms and shared bathrooms in Brazil? It's coming from Fabrizio Musso. He's saying that this model is very common in France. That's a good question, Fabrizio. Very, very interesting. And I will speak from BONARD's experience. From our experience, when we go to market and we do qualitative researches and we ask students what they don't want shared bathrooms. The preferred type of room that students want is what we said in one of the slides. It was single en suite. So it's a room with a bathroom. They are willing to share. They are willing to share the kitchen, but they are not willing to share the bathroom. Well, it's 11 o'clock, so I'll take the last question very quickly from Laura Cohen. She's asking, does the government provide some kind of financial help to your universities for upgrading the housing? In that case, what type? Professor Gabriela.
Yeah, for the federal universities, we don't have something specific for housing. We do have for assistance, but not for housing. There is not a specific program or line for this kind, but just for assistance. That can also be housing, but not one specific for housing, just amount. It's Programa Nacional de Assistência Estudantil, and then we can give to students to for eating, for housing and commuting and things like that.
Is it the same at USP, Professor Antônio Carlos?
Yeah, well, actually, more or less, yeah. The University of São Paulo is a state university, so it belongs to the state of São Paulo and not to the federal government. Therefore, we have our budget coming from the state of São Paulo. It's a percentage of the sales tax of the state of São Paulo. And once we have this budget, that the most part of that coming from the state of São Paulo, this is about $1 billion. We have autonomy to decide how to put money in personnel or in, I don't know, anything we want. So we try to keep the buildings, and this, as I said, this is not so easy. And nowadays, especially because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19, we are not having a lot of money like to spend on this kind of stuff. We are focusing on our main targets that are keep the students engaged in the university and keep the classes going on and this kind of things.
Brilliant. Well, we have some more questions in the Q&A session. What I'm going to do is we're going to collect these questions and interact with the participants who have submitted the questions, and we'd like to thank them for their participation. On behalf of BONARD, I would like to thank Professor Gabriela de Brelas and Professor Antônio Carlos Marques for their participation. Thanks to Unifesp, thanks for USP. We have learned a lot about students and student housing in Brazil. And hopefully we will have the opportunity to have you back here again on stage to discuss more on this. And as a final note, I would like to thank everybody for participating, and we will distribute the PDF with the presentation following the end of the session. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Santuza. Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you, Gabriela.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Santuza. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.